Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the webinar on the power of local economy multipliers, synergies between social protection and agriculture interventions in Malawi. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Luca Pellerano. I work for the International Labour Organization. I'm talking to you from Lusaka in Zambia, where I'm a social security advisor for the ILO. And I see we have about 30 of you online, I presume connected from various parts of the world, and probably others will join us during the course of the session. So what we have before of us today is an interesting discussion and opportunity to share with you some recent results that were produced as part of a study on the local economy multipliers of both social protection and agricultural interventions in Malawi. And we have a good panel of discussants and a great presenter. All of them have been involved in the development of the study and also in the discussion of the policy implications that the study has for Malawi, but we also think for other countries in the region, in the African region and beyond. So let me start by introducing the other members of the panel. So we can move to, I've already introduced myself. I'm Luca and work from ILO Zambia. We then have Justin Kagan, who has been one of the lead researchers on this piece of work. Justin holds a master's on agriculture and resource economics from UC Davis in California, and he's working for a consulting company called Kagan's Consulting, and has been the one of the key members of the team who has developed this local economy-wide model to assess the impact of poverty of agriculture and social protection programs on income poverty and also on production in Malawi. So has experience with building these types of ex-ante simulation models, and will tell us more about that. Welcome, Justin. We have also as discussants for this piece of work two colleagues from the government of Malawi, coming from the two most relevant, most pertinent government institutions when it comes to the social protection and to agriculture. So we have already with us Lux Kalilombe, who is working at the economic planning and EPND, economic planning department at the Ministry of Finance for the government of Malawi. He's a deputy director there. And in Malawi, the Ministry of Finance hosts a poverty reduction, poverty and social protection reduction unit where Lux works. And we will also have soon joining us, not yet online, but hopefully joining soon, Dominique, who is working for the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation and Water Development. Dominique Nkoma is the chief economist at the Ministry of Agriculture. Finally, our third panelist is discussant is Noemi Pache. Noemi is a consultant for FAO, but also as an assistant professor at the Department of Economics at University Ca' Foscari in Venice, and has worked extensively for the FAO on a range of research project, impact evaluation, and other types of analytical projects, particularly on the relationship between social protection and agricultural intervention. So we are ready to start with our program. We have planned to take about 1 hour and a half, so we'll have approximately 1 hour for presentation, the main presentation by Justin, and then some comments by the discussants, and then we'll open the floor for your comments and questions. You can follow online the discussion through the platform. You can also ask questions through the chat that you can see, and then there is also a Twitter. Hashtag that you can use to follow the discussion. If you go to the next slide, I think we'll see the hashtag there. So we very much welcome you to engage throughout the presentation by asking questions online or tweet on what is being discussed. So here's the hashtag SP.org webinar, or you can use the Twitter account for SP Gateway or the Facebook page. But equally, you can also type any questions or comments in the chat bar that you see on the I think left bottom right angle of your screen. So with this, I think we are ready to start. And let me just, before handing over to Justin, tell you 3 reasons why I think what we are discussing today is relevant not only for Malawi, but for those of us who work in developing countries on agriculture and social protection interventions. The first reason is that we often speak about spillover effect, the fact that our interventions have a broader, the effects of our interventions have a broader scope than on the direct beneficiaries that they address. And in fact, this is the reason why oftentimes people support the idea of social protection with this understanding that there are indirect effects through local economy linkages that actually support production and incomes over and beyond the beneficiaries themselves. So I think this is a good example of a study that actually puts some structure and a model around this hypothesis and gives us evidence and findings to test whether this is true, and also to discuss the extent to which these spillover effects, these indirect effects, are relevant to understanding which interventions are more cost effective than which other interventions. The second reason is in regards to the relationship within social protection and agriculture. We see in many countries, Malawi is one of them, that interventions from the agriculture and social protection sector are often implemented without effective coordination and without necessarily a full understanding as to what could be the synergies between these 2 sides of the programming tools that governments has to support livelihoods, but also to reduce poverty. And what this study explores is not only the standalone impacts of social protection and agriculture intervention, but also the impacts of their possible combinations. So we are looking into complementarities. We are looking into realization that agriculture interventions per se or social protection intervention per se may not achieve their intended objectives, and conversely, in combination, their effects could be different. So we are looking at what do these synergies, what is the change that these synergies bring into the policy space. And finally, this discussion is relevant because it helps us to enter into a conversation as to how to balance 2 primary objectives of any kind of policy efforts in developing countries, which is to, on the one hand, reduce poverty and inequality, and on the other hand, promote productivity. So we will see that throughout the presentation, these 2 sides of the equation will keep coming into play, and the work that Justin will show us somehow gives us some roots into understanding how these 2 objectives can be better balanced, and now in that sense, different interventions can respond to these 2 mutually reinforcing objectives. So with these few words, I'll hand over to Justin and for his presentation, and wish you all a good time with us this afternoon. And as I said, very much welcome all of your contributions, comments, questions throughout the session. Justin, over to you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. And thanks to Luca for the introduction. So I'll go right into the presentation. If we could have the power of local economy multipliers, synergies between social protection and agricultural interventions in Malawi. So next slide, please. So we simulated cost-benefit analysis of alternative designs of the standalone and different combinations, social protection and agricultural programs in Malawi. We brought together the priorities from the Malawi National Social Support Program and the Ministry of Agriculture, Irrigation and Water Development. And we try to ask what's the most effective policy scenario for supporting the poorest households, increasing agricultural production, stimulating economic growth, and reducing poverty and inequality. So I'll go through this. I hope that you'll be able to pick it up. Some things may be a bit complex, so again, ask questions, or we're also going to be reviewing, Noemi will be reviewing a bit of it as well. So next slide, please. So the methods we use is a local economy-wide impact evaluation, general equilibrium model, and we also look at cost-benefit analysis. So per Malawi Kwacha, what is the benefit? Next slide. So what is the local economy-wide impact evaluation? Most evaluations, they focus only on the beneficiary households, those who receive the cash transfers, the eligible poor households, but they are really just a conduit for which cash enters local economies. The whole local economy then becomes a beneficiary of the program, including those who do not get transfers. We can see that in the next slide, please. So for example, we have a cash transfer. It goes to the cash transfer eligible household in a treated village. Keep going, next. That then money is also, so that is a direct effect, you know, per Malawi Kwacha, that impacts the eligible household. That household then spends that money either on increasing their own productive activities like crop activities, livestock, you know, maybe they have a small retail shop or something, or they may go into the village and buy from traders or buy from local shops and spend that money in the local economy. Next. That then money spillovers to ineligible households, right? Households that did not originally receive the cash transfer, but are now benefiting from the extra money in the local economy. So that's spillovers into ineligible households, households that are traders, that also have maybe small shops, provide services, etc. Next. They then take that money and they spend it in perhaps another village, perhaps they spend it even going back to a treated village to buy something from them, and so on. So there's a multiplied effect throughout the local economy and even beyond. Next. We can also think about a fertilizer input subsidy program. That also has a local economy effect, but through a different channel. So for example, the fertilizer subsidy is provided to maybe a FISP eligible household in a treated village. Next. And they use that fertilizer to stimulate their production, expand the production. They earn more money from that. They then take that money and buy in the local economy, and that money then spills over to ineligible households. Next. So again, we sort of have these feedback and may even spill over to traders who may buy more goods from the local household. Next. And again, to these ineligible households. Next. Back to the treated households, or even beyond to other households, and even going to the capital and so on. For example, if they bought retail goods, a lot of the retail goods will come from other places, from cities, and this is leakages to the local economy. So what we're going to be showing you is a lot of these multiplied effects per kwacha spent. What is the multiplied effect of all this sort of impacts, the impact on the beneficiary, but also on the ineligibles added together. And then taking into account, the LUI takes into account price effects, inflationary effects, and it also takes into account money that might leak out into the major cities of Lilongwe and etc., and maybe beyond Malawi. So then those wouldn't be counted as the multiplied effect in the rural economy. Next slide. So how do you build a LUI model? You build the models with beneficiary and non-beneficiary households. You could have many of them. In this case, we'll have 10 different household models. You don't have to memorize all of them, but we build 10 of them from ultra poor to non-poor households with land, without land, constrained labor, without. And so we build these models from actual household data. We use the IHS 3 data, and we also use impact evaluations of the cash transfer and other impacts that we can find from the Public Works program and others. Next. We build models not just of the beneficiary households, but we need data on we take data from ineligible households as well, because in the simulation, again, the impacts we're looking at is the total general equilibrium impacts in the local economy, not just the effect on the beneficiaries, but the effect on non-beneficiary households as well. Next. We build this local economy in the model, and we use sort of standard equations of household economics in rural areas and how that would impact prices, how it would impact consumption, production, etc. And then we stick that model in sort of, again, designing this leakages and so on. So we combine the household models into a model of the local economy with the appropriate market equations to figure out what would happen with an impact on the local economy. Next. So then we stimulate that local economy with a policy change. What would happen if there's a cash transfer intervention? What would happen if there's a public works, if there's irrigation extension or the fertilizer input subsidy program? What would happen to the local economy? Next. So we look at these 10 different households, and again, you don't have to memorize this slide. I'm just showing you that we look at different expenditure patterns from the different households, because obviously the ultra poor will have different spending patterns than the non-poor. Maybe those with land will have different impacts with the fertilizer subsidy program as those without, and so on. So for example, most expenditures in this data was in local crops and retail shops. Production of crops is more labor intensive for the ultra poor, and all of these insights we get from the data and goes into the model. And again, we have the different household groups: constrained labor, unconstrained labor, ultra poor, moderately poor, non-poor. Next slide, please. We look at 5 specific programs. We couldn't obviously model, we could model additional ones in this, but we wanted to look at 5 main programs: 2 on the social protection side, cash transfer and public works, 3 on the agricultural programs, the FISP, the irrigation and extension fertilizer input subsidy program, agriculture, irrigation extension. And we know that on the beneficiary households, they have specific impacts. So the impacts we describe here are limited, but pretty much the main effects of the program. So cash transfer is a cash transfer, right, given to the local household. The public works program is based on a cash transfer, but for wages, but also building rural assets and skills training. Fertilizer input subsidy works off a subsidy effect, but we also estimated that there's an effect beyond that on technology change, which is using less inputs to create more output beyond the subsidy. We also look at irrigation and extension and their impact on land productivity for rural farmers and rural households. And that all affects beneficiary households. Next. Again, that's transmitted to non-beneficiary households, as we saw through those linkages, through consumption linkages, like when they spend in the local economy and their spending patterns are incorporated. Production linkages by, for example, hiring labor out, sending family labor to work on other farms, even outside of the local economy. And then that goes kind of has a feedback effect and creates these multiplied effects of Malawi, of money spent in the local economy. And also, again, there are leakages to outside. Next slide. We measure in this study, we measure per kwacha spent on the multiplied effect. We then take into account administrative costs and other costs associated with those programs to calculate cost benefits per Malawi kwacha. And we also look at poverty and inequality, which we won't go into much in this presentation, but is in the paper itself. And again, the paper has a lot more information on this, so I invite you to also read the paper when it comes out. And for simulation and combination of simulations, we looked at income effects, nominal effects, which are effects without price changes, and then real effects when we take into account that there might be inflationary effects. For example, if you get a cash transfer, it may go into increasing local production, but it also may help to bid up prices somewhat in the local economy, depending on the supply and demand factors. The reproduction effects of people expanding their production because of the intervention, and then a cost-benefit analysis. Next slide. So here's one result. These are the results. So for example, for cash transfers, on average, you're looking at, sorry, for the first scenario, you're looking at right here in this graph, you're looking at per kwacha spent, what is the impact? So we would hope that the impact would be at least over 1 kwacha, and it is. So you see the nominal, the orange bar, you see over 1 kwacha, you see 2.9 kwachas per kwacha spent. And then even if you take into account inflationary effects and so on, it does lower the multiplied, the benefit effect. And remember, this doesn't take into account administrative costs, but only the transfer cost itself. And so you get 1.88. So it's a little bit less for real income effect, but still significantly higher than 1. So the multiplied effect is not just the direct 1 kwacha given to the beneficiary household, but then is that multiplied effect when that beneficiary households, when those beneficiary households then spend that part of that kwacha in the local economy or on productive activities, and again is spent so on and so on and so forth, and all of those additional effects is that 0.88 added to that 1. So you get a total of 1.88. So you'll see a lot of that in this presentation. Go ahead, next slide. We see that across many scenarios. We do a lot of different cash transfer scenarios. We look at the current scenario, which is to the ultra poor and labor constrained households. We look what would happen if expanded in number 2 to all ultra poor, in number 3 to ultra poor, poor and labor constrained, ultra poor a higher amount, and ultra poor and labor constrained a higher amount. And so you see across every scenario, the multiplied effect of 1 kwacha is significantly more on the real incomes and the nominal incomes of just the cost of the transfer, which is just this 1 kwacha. Again, not taking into account yet administrative costs and other costs. So again, quite significantly higher. Next slide. Across all different scenarios. One of the things, though, we should look at, and what the Louis helps us to look at, is how are that multiplied effect occur? How does that multiplied effect occur? So we know that per kwacha spent, that kwacha goes immediately to the beneficiaries, most of which are poor, labor constrained, or in all of the scenarios they are the poorest in the rural economy. But when that money starts to be spent, how much of that is picked up by the beneficiary households through their expansion of production or other people buying, a feedback effect, and how much is that spent perhaps by other households in the local economy, other poor households, but also non-poor who are picking up the benefits. And so you can see that orange part, most of the benefits is picked up by non-beneficiaries rather than by beneficiaries, but even some is picked up by some of the beneficiaries in some of the scenarios. So some of that multiplied effect is obviously, and we can think about this, that this would be the case, is those who own more crops, livestock, retail business, and so on will receive more of that multiplied effect. Next, that spillover. Next slide. So per kwacha transferred, it also increased production, but most productive changes for, again, non-beneficiary households who happen to be the owners of more of the productive assets in this case. But we do see that even with beneficiary households, we have an increase in crop production per Malawi kwacha spent on the cash transfer, livestock, retail, services, and non-agricultural productions. And then also production expands for non-beneficiary households, quite significantly in crop production and retail production, local retail. Next slide. Cost-benefit ratios. Now we look at cost-benefit ratios or benefit-cost ratios. So per Malawi kwacha spent plus administrative costs of the program, what is the estimate of the total benefits, not just the impact on the beneficiaries? And so we see that in all cases, again, it's more than one, which is good. It's more than the cost of the program, and it's even significantly higher of 1.5 kwacha. So if $1 million is spent on the kwacha is spent on the cash transfer project, 1.5 million in benefits is generated by the program, taking into account admin costs as well. So very cost effective. Next slide. So again, to summarize, significant impacts on real income of beneficiary households. Cash transfers create large income spillovers, as we've seen. It has productive as well as protective impacts, despite being mainly targeted to the ultra poor. All households increase production of crops, livestock, retail, service, and production goods. Most cash transfers, spillovers, go to households that are not eligible for cash transfers. But again, when we say 1.88, we're saying that one goes directly to the poorest, and that 0.88, a little bit goes to the poorest, but then many goes to the non-beneficiaries. So in fact, it's generating benefits for the whole local economy. Go on. Next slide. Okay, now we look at the Public Works Program. Next slide. We looked at 3 different options, and I'm just going to quickly go through it. The current status quo, which is affecting about 450,000 households, 48 days of work. We looked at whether we transferred this to the ultra poor labor constrained households, and then in option 3, we looked at the poor labor unconstrained households with more days. Next slide. And we looked at with and without the creation of rural assets, which is one of the main goals of Public Works Program, is to generate effective rural assets that will increase land productivity, like watersheds and so on. And then also a Productive Works Program is transferring skills as well. So let's look at the cash transfer program first. And we look at the cash transfer and we see that it's 1.88, what we said, when it's in the status quo, what's happening right now. And next. We look at the PWP without the creation of rural assets, and this is again the multiplied effect without admin costs. And we see that when wages are transferred to ultra poor with labor households, there's not too much of a difference between the multiplied effect of the cash transfer program and the Public Works program in terms of just the multiplier. But again, this is only the transfer, and we would expect that to be the case, right, for the transfer itself. And next. But when we add in the different administrative costs, tool costs, and so on, we see that the benefit cost ratio is much higher for the cash transfer rather than for the Public Works program. Without creating effective rural assets and skills transfer, we get a much lower one. And we understand why, because there's a much more cost for running this program. So 1.49 compared to 1.414. Next. So, but if there's effective rural assets, and again, we don't have a specific study in Malawi that estimates the impact of their Public Works program, their main Public Works program, but we do have some studies from Ethiopia, and we kind of put that in there, and that's kind of a high estimate. So let's say that it has an effect, increases land productivity by 5%. Well, then we would have a bigger multiplier, and we would have a higher benefit cost ratio. So again, it has a lot of potential for creating high benefit cost ratios per kwacha spent, but it needs to be very effective. And from studies we've seen about some of the impacts by Catherine Beagle and others in Malawi, we haven't seen that kind of impact yet. So this is probably quite a high and what Malawi could achieve given a very strong Public Works program. Next. But again, because of the expenses in it, it's much less cost effective when you take into those account than the cash transfer in our simulations. Okay, let's look at the farm input subsidy programs. So we're now looking at the agricultural side on the single interventions. Next slide, please. We look at the Louis model shows us that the FISP has a higher crop production multipliers than the cash transfer, especially with this extra technology change that we've estimated by our econometric estimators. But even without that extra, just the subsidy effect, we see that the FISP creates more on the crop multiplier. For example, so people in the local economy are expanding their crop production by about 2 kwacha per kwacha spent. So that's a very good productive effect for the FISP. But even the cash transfer has some effect of 0.5 per kwacha spent because of the cash transfer. And we have the FISP multiplier with technology change, which is even higher effect on crop production. So next slide. So we would expect that to happen, right? If we spend on fertilizer and so on, we would expect that that it would have a direct crop production effect that's higher than perhaps a cash transfer. And we look at different different FISP policy options. We look at all households, for example. We also look at which is kind of the status quo, but now they're moving toward this more productive farmers, which is all the groups with land above a medium of 1.5 acres. So we're looking at that as well and simulating what would be the effect of that. And then mixed pro-poor targeting, which would be that we give it to productive farmers, but we exclude the top non-poor farmer, and we also exclude the bottom, the ultra-poor labor-constrained households. So we have 8 households simulated as beneficiaries rather than 10. And then mixed less pro-poor targeting gives it only to the non-poor and moderately poor with land, productive farmers, and we completely exclude the ultra-poor. Next slide. We can see that in the bars that are going up there, those are the beneficiary crop production multipliers. So we see that it stimulates, the FISP stimulates beneficiary households as we would expect. And like I showed you in the previous slide, crop production expands. But we see that also non-beneficiary households reduce their crop production because in the local economy, we're also taking into account prices. When they expand the production, prices of local crops go down. It becomes less attractive as a source of income and activities, and non-beneficiaries will reduce their activities and maybe go into other activities. This doesn't mean that the net effect isn't positive, but it will have an effect on crop production of non-beneficiaries if in the local economy. Next slide. And unfortunately, in some of our situations and scenarios that we did, like this mixed less poor targeting, when the FISP is only targeted to the well-off with land, we see that there are negative spillover effects. So that even the poor, which is this gray bar, will reduce. That's in the far right side of your screen. The last one, mixed less poor targeting. You see they even reduce a little bit their kind of their real income. Sorry, the total real income effect is actually negative or 0. And we see that if we go from all households, which is the status quo, which is that first scenario, and we go to more productive households, we do have a greater effect, not just on production, but also on these real income multipliers. So per kwacha spent, it has a bigger effect on the non-poor households, the poor households, and ultra-poor. So it may be a good idea based on these simulations to switch to more productive farmers, but also ultra-poor farmers. Now, when we looked at mixed pro-poor targeting, when we take out the non-poor and we take out the lowest ultra-poor labor constraint, we see that it has an even greater effect overall on the ultra-poor, on the poor and non-poor multiplied effects. And then again, with this mixed less pro-poor targeting, we have sort of negative, much less effect from that scenario where we just target it toward the better off productive farmers. Next slide. FISP can have production effects, and this is, we also do, in the model, we also look at percent increases. So I invite you to look at the paper to see also not just these multiplier effects, but also in terms of percent increase from the base. We have those effects as well. And we can look at percent increase, for example, in income, but also in this graph, we look at crop production. And we see that when we go from status quo to landed households, we increase. Mixed pro-poor targeting, it has good increases, but then again, in mixed less pro-poor targeting, the percent increase is much less. And again, though, some of these, you have to look also that the number of beneficiary households changes depending on the scenario. Sometimes it doesn't change. For example, from the number in the status quo is 900,000 households receive the FISP, but all landed households are productive farmers, again, 900,000 receive the FISP. But in mixed pro-poor targeting, less receive the FISP, but again, there's significant increase in crop production. And in mixed less poor targeting, more receive the FISP, but there's less increase in crop production. Next slide. Okay, sorry. I think I was disconnected for just a second. We have FISP can have high benefit cost ratios with both a subsidy and added technology change, but may have negative effects on non-beneficiaries. Next. We see that it has some positive effects, and we see that they can have significant benefit cost ratios. Next. But they can also have very low and even less than 1, so that the cost exceeds the benefit of it, but only in this sort of less pro-poor targeting and a lower subsidy. Okay, next slide, please. Next. So FISP stimulates crop production in all scenarios and increases both nominal and real incomes of targeted households. Moving to households to more productive farmers increases production and income, but non-targeted households may not benefit. Subsidized inputs stimulate crop production and drive down prices. This negatively affects crop producers who do not receive the subsidy. And if they don't also benefit from lower crop prices as buyers, the net effect may be reduce the cost benefit to even less than 1. When the FISP also impacts technology, as I said, outside of the subsidy and impacts productivity, the real income and cost benefit ratios are higher. Next slide. Okay, combined policy. Next slide. Now we're going to look at what happens when we put more than one simulation in the model itself, because we can do that with the simulation. So we look at combined policy option with and without technology change of the FISP and without public works program. We have in the paper, we have 5 policy options, but we're only going to be looking at 3 of them. So sorry, we're only going to be looking at 3 of them. So option A, we're going to look at a combined cash transfer of status quo, what's happening right now in Malawi, with a FISP to more productive farmers, those with 1.5 acres or above. And B, option B, reallocation of resources with non-overlapping targeted. So the cash transfer will go to the ultra poor and the FISP will go to non-poor and poor households with land above the median, this 1.5 productive hectares. And then we'll look at option E at the very bottom, reallocation of resources with fully overlapping targeting to ultra poor households. So FISP and cash transfer targeting all ultra poor households. And we have others, you can read the paper, and I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, next slide. Combined options income multiplied by poverty group. So we look at those 3 options and we can see sort of their combined impact per Malawi kwacha spent. And again, we have this total real income multiplier for the local economy that's taking out leakages and so on. We have non-poor real income multiplier. We have the poor, moderately poor, and we have the ultra poor And we see that they all have impacts. They all have significant impacts, especially if you look at the total real income across all the simulations. They have more than one, so their impact per kwacha transferred in these combined options spent, is more than the cost of it. And but we also see in this, we see that the non-overlapping is not quite as high among the ultra poor and among the total effect as when we do fully overlapping targeting. So we target both the FISP and the ultra poor and the cash transfer to the ultra poor labor constrained households. Okay, next slide. Sorry, yeah, to the ultra poor labor constrained with land households. Okay, and we also look at the benefit cost ratios when we take into account admin costs from the cash transfer and from the FISP, and even with the public works when we add that into the third scenario. And we see again that they all have significant benefit cost ratios, and the one with the fully overlapping is higher than the one with the non-overlapping. But even taking into account admin effects, these programs are cost effective. Next. When we look at the combined cash transferred and the FISP with this sort of productivity enhancement, we can see that they are higher than just the cash transfer alone. And you can see that next, 1.94 versus 2.4 in the benefit cost ratio. And the income multiplier is also bigger. So you see that the cash transfer alone has a significant benefit cost ratio, but then when you put into next, sorry, and I've made an error in the slide. It should not be 1.94, I apologize, it should be 1.59. So apologize that it's a mistake there in the slide. But anyway, it's significantly greater when you have the combined cash transfer and FISP with technology change, 2.4. Okay, next slide, please. The fully overlapping scenario is higher than the non-overlapping, like we showed. 1.46 is the benefit cost ratio as opposed to 2.12. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, oh, sorry, this slide. Okay, so again, to summarize, technology change, whether from FISP, the PWP with rural assets, remember just with the creation of effective rural assets and skills transfer, irrigation and extension, which we don't show here, but we show in the paper, it has a similar type of productivity effect. It enhances the impacts of protective policy interventions, such as the cash transfer and the public works transfer. And interventions that raise agricultural productivity, it lowers food costs and has positive real income effects for poor households. But again, for non-beneficiaries, poor households of the FISP, for example, they may have some negative effects. So fully overlapping can have a larger impact than their non-overlapping counterpart in these simulations. And conversely, cash transfers, which increase food demand, create new markets for food production stimulated by productive interventions. So we can see that there are some synergies as well. When you give the cash transfers and the FISP helps expands production. Also, it helps increase cash income, and cash transfers increases cash and also stimulates production, not as much, but these combined effects really create good cost benefits for the local economy. Next. Impacts are often bigger than people think, as you can see from this presentation. Many impact studies miss most of the impacts by not estimating these spillovers. If we don't estimate these spillovers, we miss a large part of what these transfers and agricultural programs do for the local rural economy of Malawi. So thank you. There's other conclusions as well, but Noemi, oh, can you do next slide? Sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to acknowledge that many people went into making this study happen. Luke switches on, Noemi, Luca, Florian, not here, Silvio, Marco, too many to count, and many people in country as well. I'm very thankful for all the Malawians who helped with this project as well. It was really a combined effort. So thank you very much. And that's the end. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Justin, for a very rich presentation. And the task of our discussants now is to kind of extract from it some of the key points, the policy implications for those of us who have had a bit more time to also digest. As you have all seen, there is quite a lot of information, and is really touching on some critical policy debates. Before I give the floor to the discussants, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are receiving questions on the chat. The chat is going to be the only way to put your question to the panel for the discussion. So please put your questions, your observations, your comments into the chat so that we can have a good discussion amongst ourselves. And I also want to remind all of you that the paper and the policy brief, which has been prepared for this study, are available on the webinar web page. In fact, up to a few minutes ago, we only had the full report, but if you refresh that webinar web page, you will now also find the policy brief for this piece of work. So you can take a look at this, as well as the full report after the webinar. And please feel free to be in touch with ourselves, with the organizers, if you have questions or you would like to discuss further. So without losing any more time, I want to suggest that we go to our panelists, our discussants, for their quick comments. And I would like to go first to Noemi Pace from FAO. I know that she has a presentation with few policy implications of the study. I'll ask all of the panelists to try and keep their interventions as short as possible so we can have enough time for discussion. So the floor to Noemi for her contribution.
Hi, Luca. Thank you. Yeah, I prepared some slides for summarizing the main results of the presentation of Justin, and also some policy recommendation. Next slide, please. These were at the end of Justin's presentation, just in case of questions. Next slide, next slide, next slide. Maybe we can go back to this irrigation extension policy implication later on, but if you can proceed to the beginning of my discussion, would be great. Okay, yeah, thank you. So what I was saying, I would like to summarize only in a few slides the main results of the report, which is quite rich in results and discussion, and then present some policy recommendations that are already included in the report and also in the policy brief. Next slide, please. So the study that Justin just presented is the first to analyze the local economy multiplier of standalone interventions and also their combinations with a specific focus on the synergies between social protection and agricultural interventions. And this study shows clearly that selected programs have direct impacts on beneficiary households and also generate income and productive spillovers affecting non-targeted households. So two main contributions, he consider the local economy multiplier of single programs and also a combination of the programs, and also highlight the importance of income spillovers and production spillovers, which are the effects not only on the beneficiaries, on the direct beneficiaries of the program, but also on the non-beneficiary households. Next slide, please. So what is the importance of income spillovers? Income spillovers, as already Justin discussed and also Luca mentioned, are an important component of cost-benefit analysis, because basically they strengthen the argument of the effectiveness of social protection and productive interventions, basically capturing the full impact of intervention in rural economies. They make clear the fact that both social interventions but also agricultural intervention do not have only an impact on the direct beneficiaries, but are able to have impacts also on non-beneficiary households. Next slide, please. The study of the income spillovers is also important because income spillovers per se have important implications for equity. Let me give you an example which is discussed in the report. Non-poor and moderately poor households benefit significantly from the social cash transfer, even if they do not receive the money. This because they have the resources to expand production in response to rising local demand. So those category of households, non-poor and moderately poor, are able to benefit a lot from the social cash transfer, even if they are not the direct beneficiaries. On the contrary, households that are asset poor, for example, because they are severely labor constrained, do not have the capacity to respond to these additional resources put into the economy, and in their case, income gains depend upon whether or not they are benefiting directly from transfers. These are have important policy implications that I will discuss in few slides. Next slide, please. What about the productive spillovers? So also productive spillover are important, but most important is to consider the fact that ignoring production spillovers not only misses program benefits, but also creates the risk of missing negative and direct impacts that actually could be avoided with complementarity policies. Let me give you an example. The farm input subsidy program, as Justin already discussed, raises the market supply of food crops and pushes down prices. So any food producers who actually does not receive the farm input subsidy program could suffer. FISP, so the farm input subsidy program, could also be regressive if it does not lower food costs, or if it's not combined with cash transfer to poor farm households that are not benefiting from FISP. Next slide, please. So the study highlights 5 main policy recommendations. So the first policy recommendation refers to the importance of the social cash transfer. Now, if poverty reduction is one of the objectives for the government of Malawi, the coverage of the social cash transfer should be extended, because the results show that the social cash transfer has the largest impact on beneficiaries' poverty level. So the results on poverty were not shown and not discussed by Justin in the presentation, but are discussed in the paper. So I suggest to go again to read the paper on this point. So this first policy recommendation basically suggests to expand the social cash transfer if policy reduction is the objective of the government. And the reason why is because as asset poor households have limited capacity to benefit from spillovers and depend mainly on transfers from income gains, it is vital that they benefit directly from adequate transfers. Next slide, please. So this second policy recommendation refers to the public work programs. The results show that public work programs are only cost effective if they build assets and transfer skills that increase productivity. In order to make public work program more cost effective, it's important to ensure relevance and quality of assets generated, and also there is a need of an increased focus on skills. So ensuring relevance and quality of assets and also an increased focus on skills should be a priority. Next slide, please. This policy recommendation and also the following one refers to the farm input subsidy program. So policy recommendation number 3, the cost effectiveness of the farm input subsidy program depends on whether it increases productivity beyond the subsidy. So implementers should consider providing additional productivity support such as extension services or irrigation project. Next slide, please. So policy recommendation number 4 again refers to the farm input subsidy program, in particular to the target of the farm input subsidy program. So targeting the farm input subsidy program to poor and ultra poor farmers with land rather than better off farmers seems to produce larger income and production multiplier for the economy as a whole, as the poor and ultra poor are able to expand production as a result of the farm input subsidy program. These findings are important because it should provide information on the ongoing discussion on the need to focus the farm input subsidy program only on the productive farmers and highlighting the productive potential of Malawi's poor and vulnerable. Next slide. So the next slide is linked to this policy recommendation. So there is a debate in a discussion going on whether the fees should be targeted only to the more commercially oriented farmers. And this policy recommendation addressed this point. So the proposal of retargeting the farm input subsidy program toward productive households could be beneficial, but it needs to be combined with a more robust social cash transfers to the ultra poor, and also should be combined with additional production support for the non-beneficiary poor farmers in order to mitigate the negative effects on crop prices. This could come in the form of targeted extension services, targeted irrigation projects, and also livelihood support. Next slide, please. So next slide presents the final policy recommendation. One of the main results is that a full or at least partial overlap of the farm input subsidy program and the social cash transfer on the poor not only produces higher multipliers for the whole economy compared to non-overlapping targeting, but also has a better distributional impact, with larger increase of income and production among the poorest households. Next slide, please. So as a consequence of these results, and also as a consequence of many results which are included in the report, if the policy goal is to raise rural incomes and also increase crop production, it's clear that combining social and productive interventions is a more effective strategy than doing either one of these alone. And this main policy recommendation is linked to the introduction that Luca gave to this webinar, and is the main conclusion of this study. Thank you. Next slide is the thank you slides. I think I said all I wanted to discuss. Thank you.
Noemi. These comments really bring us forward to looking at the policy implications of the study. And so I would like to now ask our colleagues from the government of Malawi, starting from Lux, and then we'll go to Dominic, to give us their short comments as to what do they think is relevant in the study vis-a-vis the ongoing policy discussions that are taking place in Malawi. We start from Lux. Lux works for the unit of the government of Malawi, who is in charge of setting the policy framework and also supporting the implementation for social protection programs in the country. So Lux, what do you make of the main findings of this study, and what do you think is particularly relevant for government to take forward? Over to you. If you can keep it short, maybe 2-3 minutes, then we'll move on to Dominic and we'll open for questions. So colleagues, remember, send your questions. We have received a few, but we can address a few more before we wrap up today.
Yes. In Malawi, thank you for the good presentation. We had it in Malawi, we had it again today. Most of the recommendations are relevant. Actually, they are contributing to what we've been discussing in Malawi, the overlap between agriculture and social protection. So all the policy recommendations are relevant. What is challenging now is that maybe we as EP&D and agriculture, we should agree on our targeting methods, on objectives, and see how we go forward. Basically, the results are okay with us. What is needed is the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lux. Maybe I'll come back to you in a second, just maybe to hear from you out of the different findings, what are the issues that you find are particularly interesting or maybe novel or new to what was already known about the impact of social protection and agriculture in Malawi. But for the time being, let me ask Dominic what are his comments, observations, main highlights from the study from the perspective of the Minister of Agriculture, and maybe then I'll come back to you, Lux, in case you want to highlight any specific finding that you think is noticeable. So Dominic, over to you. Dominic, can you hear us? Okay, I think Dominic is probably still trying to sort out there may be some connection issues. We cannot hear you now, Dominic. So let us go back to Lux. Lux, is there any specific finding that you would want to highlight or emphasize? I mean, what in this study you think adds new perspectives on the understanding of social protection and agriculture in Malawi?
To me, I think what is coming out clear to me is that we've done a lot of assessments on social protection and the impacts separate from agriculture. They've had their own studies and impacts. But I think we never took a chance to look at the spillovers. So we tend to underrate what we're doing on the ground because we don't take into account the spillovers. So for me, as a policy recommendation, what I agree to take forward is to look at the two policy spillovers, income spillovers, the efficiencies, and move forward. Recommend to our seniors and implement. To me, that is coming out clearly from the recommendations. Can you hear me?
Let us see if we can bring Dominic on board. We probably need a few more minutes. Maybe we'll ask him to close at the end. And therefore, in the meantime, I'd like to ask the team to start addressing some of the questions that are coming from our participants. And I also invite participants, this is the time to ask your questions. So keep sending your questions. So far, we have received a couple of them. And the first one is from Roland, who is asking specifically about the issues to do with inequality. Let me read the question to you or summarize it to you. To what extent does this analysis look at the impact on inequality? My own recent fieldwork in Lesotho suggests that a lot of the multiplier might end up with a relatively well-off people in communities. At the same time, there are concerns that the FISIP in Malawi does not always reach the poorest beneficiaries. This then begs the question of how these interventions contribute to or reduce inequality. I believe this is a great question. Actually speaks about asks whether this approach of estimating not only direct impacts but spillover effects, the local economy impacts, is shedding any more lights of issues to do with inequality and the extent to which social protection and agriculture can tackle inequality. I want to ask Justin and Noemi to come on board here. What would you say on this point? I think it has been touched on, but what would you highlight on this issue of inequality? Justin, you want to start?
Sure. I think in the paper we do effects on poverty and inequality. It should be in the appendix. These are sort of absolute effects of the different programs, and overall they don't have large movements in the inequality as a whole for the rural economy, which seems like it might be obvious considering that these programs represent a small amount of actual stimulation in the local economy, but nevertheless they do contribute, or they mostly either lower inequality or raise it. At this exact moment, I'm not sure which programs lower it or which programs might raise it. But I'm pretty sure that the cash transfer, because it's directed toward the ultra poor, obviously ends up lowering it. Remember, the main impact is on the beneficiary households. So if it is targeted toward the ultra poor, the main impact, the one of the Malawi Kwacha, is affecting the very poor. Only the spillover may be picked up by non-beneficiaries, and yeah, it may lower the inequality. I mean, it may lower the impact on inequality to lessen it, right? Because more of the non-poor are receiving the spillover, as we've mentioned. So the actual effect on inequality may not be as high. But for a cash transfer, again, the most, if it's targeted toward the ultra poor, it will have an effect on lowering inequality. We just, the ultimate, the big effect is small. You can see it in the paper, but it does occur. And you're absolutely right that the spillover may lessen that. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask Noemi maybe her views here. What I think is interesting is in what way does this broader focus not only on direct but also on indirect spillover effects change our perspectives on the distributional impacts of these programs?
Okay. Yeah, this follows up Justin's reply. What is clear from the study is that this issue of inequality created by standalone interventions is lower when an intervention is combined with another intervention, in particular when a social protection intervention is combined with an agricultural intervention. Let me give you a simple example. The social cash transfer increase income for beneficiaries, but also income for non-beneficiaries. And this will increase the demand for food and also in general the demand for general goods, general consumption goods. Now, but let's focus only on the increase in price of the increase in the demand for food. If this kind of intervention is now combined with the farm input subsidy program, which at the same time reduces the crop prices, we will see an increase in crop prices, and of course this will create an imbalance between those that have greater income because they are better off or because they receive the cash transfer with respect to households that were left out. So what is clear from the study is that this issue of inequality is reduced or is less severe when different interventions, social protection intervention and agricultural interventions are combined. And especially when there is a partial overlapping or a full overlapping between social cash transfer and the farm input subsidy program on the poor households.
Thank you, Noemi. In fact, I think this point of the additional perspective that the study brings on issues of inequalities is, in my opinion, one of the most novel and most interesting contributions of this piece. So what the study is telling us is that we cannot really look at poverty and inequality impacts by just following the direct impacts on the beneficiaries, because so much more is happening on how non-beneficiaries indirectly also benefit from programs. Let me just give two examples. When we look at the social cash transfer, and that's why I think the relevant comment question is very pertinent. When we look at the social cash transfer, we are clearly seeing that there is an effect on the that spillover effects, that the local economy impacts benefit relatively more non-beneficiaries than beneficiaries, meaning that those who actually have gains from the indirect effects on the local economy are generally better off households, and that overall reduces the total effect on inequality that the intervention has, compared to a situation where spillover effects were, say, benefiting more beneficiaries themselves. So I think this is a case in which the study is somehow giving us a strong signal that it is very important to ensure that the very poor benefit from these programs, because the non-poor benefit anyways in the form of the spillover effects that they receive by operating in the market, in the retail sector, by expanding their production. Another good example of these distributional effects through spillover effects is the case of the fertilizer input subsidy program. What we are seeing is that households, beneficiary households, particularly the most poor, the ultra poor, if they are not targeted, if they are left out, they are worse off for two reasons. The first reason is because they don't receive the benefit itself. But the second reason is to do with spillover effects, because prices go down because other households in that community are able to produce more. And if those poor households are also net producers, they are worse off. They're not worse off only because they lose the transfers, in this case the subsidy input, but they're also worse off because they're negatively affected by the spillovers, in this case the negative spillovers on prices. So I think this is a very interesting nuance and insights that the study gives, that we cannot really judge a program only by looking at its direct impacts on the beneficiaries. We need to understand what other dynamics, what other spillover effects are circulating through the economy. We have a second question, and I think we still have few minutes to take few more questions, so I very much encourage colleagues to send their questions. This is the time to send your questions to Justin, Noemi, and then we will go back to also to Dominic, if we manage, and to Lux. The second question is about timeline of short-term versus long-term impact. So this is a question from Claire, and she's asking to Justin in particular, when I would be interesting for you to clarify, okay, on the timeline of this study, I presume how long did it take to perform the study? And maybe you can tell a bit more, Justin, as to what are the data sources for the study. What is the study built on in terms of the data that underpins the work? But also, what are your thoughts on the timeline for immediate versus short-term impacts in terms of spillover? I presume here it should be like, what are the short-term versus long-term spillovers I mean, how do we expect spillover to manifest if we compare a short-term versus medium to long-term perspective? Justin, do you have any answer to these?
Yeah. So this is a great question. We basically the study to take the data. I mean, if the data is already available, we use the Malawi household from the third round. I believe there's a fourth round out there now, but we use from the third round, and basically we have to do the analysis, build the model, and so on. So it takes about 6 to 8 months. Now the actual and then produce the reports, obviously, but I think the question is about sort of the timeline of what the Louis model sort of does. Obviously, you could simulate any kind of timeline you want in the model. But for this model, we use the data as our primary source, right? So we're looking at basically yearly data, or estimating sort of yearly income, yearly expenditures, and crop production for the year, livestock, and so on. So the model is sort of for a year. This is a very good question about immediate impacts versus short-term versus maybe medium and long-term. What sort of anecdotal evidence tells us is that, for example, for a cash transfer, the effect is almost immediately. Because of these are ultra poor households, they take the cash and they immediately go and purchase something in the local economy, usually more goods and services or so on. And so we've talked to retail shops and so on, which they know when the cash transfer is coming, they know to expand their production and to invest and so on, and to capture that extra income. Now, for the fertilizer input subsidy program, this might take a longer time. That you need to invest in the agricultural production that expands production, right? It sells the crops in the market, you receive income, and so on. So this takes perhaps about a cropping season at least. A year is probably the right. So we try to sort of measure all of the impacts on sort of a yearly basis. So the cash transfer, we do all of the different cash transfers over the year. But you could really build the model however you think. But we think that the assumption of a year is probably good in terms of how people are spending their money, how they're impacted. Now, on the long term, behaviors change, programs change, and so on. And so you may get completely different. So it's useful to update the model with sort of the new data that's coming in Malawi, for example, to see whether things have changed and whether the multipliers itself will change. So again, a very good question. And also it sort of provokes sort of more research on spillovers and sort of timing of those sort of spillovers. And that's something that may be good, not just to simulate, but also to sort of estimate as well. And we've tried to estimate impacts of these spillovers in Lesotho. We have a paper should be coming out soon on those sort of general equilibrium impacts in Lesotho, but also based on RCT, randomized control trials, as well as the simulation itself. So showing that these spillovers exist. But then the next step is to look at maybe different types of spillovers, effects on inequality, poverty, more, and so on. So this is a very good question. Thank you.
Make an attempt to see if Dominic can come on board. Dominic, if you can try and talk. Yeah, Dominic, great, you can hear you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Sorry for the challenge that we had. I think Luke has touched almost all the relevant points for me. Since I'm in the agriculture sector, probably can comment on FISP and the results that you are coming out of this study. I think there are two issues: the impact of FISP on the direct beneficiaries of FISP, and then what it does to the production of non-beneficiaries. For the direct beneficiaries, I think the immediate result is that they expand production, and when integrated with extension services, also productivity. So we've results that suggest that that's the case. But then we also know from our policy processes that after production, after the harvest, then we go into a period where government also needs to intervene to stabilize the prices. When we don't do that, then we have a situation that appears to negate the impact of the FISP, in the sense that the prices decline so fast, probably in the first 6 months or so. The reason prices go down is because of also the fact that is in the end the economics of marginal pricing don't work. The effective marginal prices that the FISP recipients also see is the price, the cost to them based on the cost that takes out the FISP contribution, and also the labor contribution. So I think that's why you see in the model that in the results that the response now from non-beneficiaries of FISP is to reduce production. On the beneficiaries, the implications is that they accept lower prices because that the price is based on what they push into the production. So in the end, we end up with a situation where most beneficiaries who are also subsistence will need support towards the last 7 to 10 to 12 months of the year. I think then it goes to the recommendation to combine the agricultural intervention and the social protection interventions. The challenge there, of course, becomes creating the institutional mechanisms that can one ensure that there's the objectives of the FISP are met at the same time. We also protect the non-beneficiaries, because for national food security, for example, you still need the non-beneficiaries of FISP will respond in significant ways to the price distortions that the FISP program also brings. I think from the results, one thing that's coming to me probably would be to if maybe in the extension of the work, we could consider also assessing whether the FISP program, the resources towards FISP, could move in a way of cash transfers to the same beneficiaries, but then have a mechanism where the inputs get to them. That we ensure that we don't distort input prices, input markets, and then probably also the market prices. Probably I can stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I think these were excellent observations and comments. I think they really help us put these findings in context and really see how the findings actually speak to many of the ongoing debates on the reform of, in this case, the FISP program in Malawi. I just have one final question myself that I would like to ask, and I would like to ask it to Lux. There is an interesting finding. Actually, let me ask two questions, one to Lux and one to Dominic, and then we can wrap up, because I don't think we have received any more questions. So it is time for these last two questions, and then we can close the seminar. My question to Lux is, one of the interesting findings of the study is in regards to the public works program. What the study seemed to show is that, according to this modeling exercise, unless public works have a strong investment in building assets and also transferring skills to beneficiaries, they are not the most cost-effective option to actually deliver wages themselves or to support income. Social cash transfers come out have been more cost-effective unless you model that public works are going to make a significant improvement to the productivity of those beneficiaries who participate in the program. I wanted to ask, okay, I realize Lux had to leave. I didn't realize that before, but let me then turn this question to Justin or to Noemi in case they have any views there. What does it mean? I mean, what should public works do to have a stronger focus on building assets and transfer skills? Do you have any ideas there?
I would like to hear maybe Dominique would Dominique like to reply as well, maybe, to this question. But yeah, I'm curious as well, because from evidence so far, but I know in conversations with GIZ and with others, this is really a desire for them to make public works create effective rural assets, like through watershed or development. And it hasn't happened really. I mean, the evidence is not there yet, but I would hope that maybe this study would sort of stimulate that desire to really try to invest to make the program more efficient. Because as we showed in the cost benefits, if they are able to make even a few percentage points increase in productivity for the rural economy, this could have a lot better impacts on benefits, and therefore on their sort of benefit cost ratios.
Just wanted to add on Justin replies. So for my understanding, up to now, the public work program did not improve skills. So in the public work program, there was not any kind of training for people participating on it. So the work they are doing basically is very inefficient, because it's not aimed to be more productive in the future. So what seems to be really missing is a component in the public work programs that transfer skills to those people participating to the public work programs. But yeah, I would like to hear as well from Dominique, because he certainly has a better view.
Yeah, I'm not
okay, so
a
let
specialist.
me.
Hello.
Dominique, let me bring in another question. Okay, we have actually a comment by one of our colleagues, Mito Sumakoto, who is saying, I would turn the question around, Luca. In Justin's slides, he says that if public works do not also create public productive assets and or skills transfers, if this is the case, the public works in Malawi may wish to evaluate their public works programs to see how they can increase productivity and skills transfers. Also, I wonder whether if you had been able to quantify the benefits coming from the assets themselves, for example, access to basic services, better irrigation, etc. So I think that's a very interesting perspective. And I think it all boils down to the question as to how can we support public works program, we know they're very large in Malawi, to actually deliver on their promises of building assets and transferring skills that can in turn improve the productivity of those participating in those works, but also of the communities. And there are a number of international debates, for example, as to whether public works could allow participants to build assets, build private assets that can actually help them improve their own household level productivity, as well as I think the point that Noemi raised, what else could be done to focus not only on assets, but focus on skills that are going in turn to increase productivity levels. I'm sure this could be the subject of another conversation in the future. My last question to Dominique before we wrap up is specifically on the FISP. We have seen in many countries in the region, in Zambia and Malawi, for example, a move of programs such as FISP towards more productive farmers. So farmers with land, with an aspiration of supporting graduation into commercial farming. But the findings of this report suggest that it's very risky to leave out the most vulnerable farmers, those that have land but maybe no capacity to work, or those who have land but maybe are ultra poor and cash constrained. So I wanted to ask Dominic, and the study suggests that this is the group that can be mostly affected if FISIP is taken away from them, because they can be affected also by the price effects, as you rightly put it. I wanted to ask Dominic, do you think Malawi is ready to target FISIP in conjunction with another program such as the social cash transfer to the same households? We see that the largest impacts are coming out of an overlapping targeting of both income support in the form of cash and productive support, for example, in the form of input subsidies or other type of agricultural interventions on the same households. Is Malawi, you think, ready for that? Is something that the Malawi government would see favorably, or what kind of concerns could there be around that?
Yeah, I think from our side, we've already demonstrated that we are keen to reform the FISP program, discussions around the social protection objective of FISP, for example, has come often in policy discourse. The the main challenge there, as I pointed out, is it's not about leaving out the ultra poor and the poor out of FISIP, but rather finding a mechanism where they still access the benefits of FISIP. For example, food, which is food security, which is the objective of the partial objective of FISIP to improve food security through enhancing own production. So I think balancing targeting productive farmers versus the non-productive or the land constrained farmers, let me call them. I think it's a big question. I don't think we've any objection from the agriculture side. The concern still becomes the readiness of not the agriculture sector, but rather the social protection sector to absorb the impact, the size of the beneficiaries for the social protection schemes such as social cash transfer. That would result from the shift. As I pointed out, maybe 80% of what we're doing would qualify as social protection. When we give out FISIP, after 9 months or so, we have to go back and either give out food handouts. At the moment, discussions have suggested maybe instead of food handouts, you can also give out cash transfers to food insecure households. So in that sense, we are almost thinking on how we can enhance, we can improve the subsidy program without jeopardizing the welfare, the livelihoods of those that are current beneficiaries on the program. So it's something that is feasible. It's the direction that government has thought about. The reforms have been initiated, but that also requires probably stronger commitment on the social protection side to absorb the implications that this entails. Yeah, thanks,
Dominic. I think it's time for us to wrap up. It has been a very interesting discussion, and I would like to thank all of you that participated. Let me just finish by highlighting what, in my view, are maybe two take-home messages from this discussion and from the study, and I encourage you to go look for the study and the policy brief on the webinar page, and to contact us and the authors if you would like to discuss any of these points forward. I would like to just highlight two take-home points. The first one is, what we have seen is that social protection and agriculture programs have effect over and above their direct beneficiaries. And this is a powerful message, for example, to the Ministry of Finance, when we advocate for expansion of programs that support the poor, to actually show that for every dollar spent on a program such as the social cash transfer, a public works program, or an agricultural input subsidy program, actually we are seeing that in some cases up to another dollar, another $1.50 are created in the economy through the positive effects that those initial injections have on production and also on local demand. That's something that I think this study documents and put together in a way that hopefully can also help other countries. Maybe other countries could replicate this similar studies to actually advocate for increased financing of pro-poor programs or social protection, inclusive social protection as an agriculture programs. And then the other policy take-home point is about synergies in policy making. We hear very much, we hear often in many debates that there is some resistance to this notion of double dipping, that governments don't want to give the same household, the same beneficiary, more than one intervention, that it is better to spread the benefits around to as many beneficiaries as possible. And the study seems to suggest that instead double dipping is good, that overlapping targeting makes sense, that having the same program supporting both income and production capacity, and that can be a combination of cash plus fertilizer input subsidy program, or could be a public works program that at the same time provides a wage but also improves productivity, actually has much larger results in terms of the overall impacts on poverty and inequality reduction, but also on the overall benefits for the economy. So from now onwards, the notion that double dipping may be a good idea to promote rather than something to stay away from. I'd like to end this panel discussion and seminar on this note. I'd like to thank again Justin, Noemi, Dominic, and Lux for their inputs and contributions, all of you for your questions. And I also want to remind you that there is a survey available after the webinars. We are warmly invited to respond to the seminar, to the survey, so we can improve the organization of future similar webinars in the months and years to come. Thanks also to the socialprotection.org team, who have been very instrumental for the organization of this webinar, and thanks for bearing with us in a relatively last-minute preparation. But I'm very happy with the discussion we've had, and hopefully more discussions will follow on the importance of looking at local economy-wide impacts of the interventions we work on. Have a great evening, all of you, and talk to you soon. All the best.